The next morning was a particularly gloomy day. Dark clouds hung over the northern isles, and rain poured down from the heavens like waterfalls. Adakis sat alone in the dining hall, silently listening to the sounds of the storm as he waited for Marcus's arrival. It was a rather long time before his figure appeared in the doorway, drenched in trailing rainwater across the marble. The journey from the island of Ghent in his sailboat had been treacherous in the storm, and he had been delayed when one of his sails had torn. The wind was beating so violently that the sail was rent in two across the center, leaving the little boat to be tossed about by the waves without guided direction. By the hand of the goddess, Marcus's boat had drifted toward the shore, and he had escaped the storm without being harmed. But he told Adakis, as he lingered in the doorway, that it would be some time before he would again be able to set sail. Adakis, of course, told his friend that he was welcome to stay in Calister until the repairs were made to his sailboat. Finally stepping out of the doorway into the dining room, leaving a puddle of rainwater on the tile where he had been standing, Marcus unbuttoned his overcoat and slung it over the backing of the chair beside the table before taking his seat across from Adakis. His gray waistcoat and a white undershirt were also drenched by rain and seawater, but he tried to ignore the discomfort. Not long after Marcus had arrived, a servant had delivered the trays of their breakfast to the table and had served their cups of tea. Adakis brushed a strand of his dark hair off of his face and leaned forward in his chair, hushing his voice so that Salvador would not be able to hear them from upstairs, and without hesitation began telling his friend what had been on his mind since the night before. He told him of Salvador's shrine to the gypsy woman, and of his suspicion that the girl had given him an earring doused in poison. Marcus dragged his chair closely so that his elbows were propped firmly on the tabletop, and he listened attentively. When he learned of Adakis's lie to bring the girl to Salvador when she was found, he stopped his friend and gazed at him with a confused expression. He explained that he had seen the girl Justine many times since the festival, that she had made frequent visits to the island of Ghent. But he halted Adakis from speaking at that point, continuing to say that he had also seen the girl with a young man. The man had been one of the dwellers in the kingdom of Ghent, but had moved to the forest with Justine's gypsy clan when the two had fallen in love. Adakis was astonished to hear that the girl was in love with another man, after the way she had accepted Salvador's advances. Adakis explained that it wouldn't matter either way, and pleaded for Marcus's help in a plan to save Salvador's mind. Marcus was baffled by his friend's sudden request, but Adakis did not hesitate to explain himself. The drawings and the carvings, we have to destroy them. This was an unexpected turn of events for Marcus, and he did not like the idea of destroying Salvador's things. But Adakis pleaded, stating that it would be better to remove Salvador's obsession of the girl from him forcefully, reasoning that it would be for Salvador's own good to destroy any trace of the girl, including Salvador's shrine, and that he would find a way to destroy the earring too, eventually. With his brow furrowed, Marcus bit his lower lip thoughtfully before he finally answered, "For his sake, I'll help you." Adakis silently thanked his friend and rested his head in his hands. His next task was to distract Salvador so that the deed could be done. Adakis arranged for Salvador to be invited to the King of Kenedac's banquet that evening. King Santiago was a stern and silent man, but his daughter, Princess Rachel, was a kind and gentle soul. She was beautiful too, having long hickory hair and eyes the shade of pine trees. She and Adakis had met only a few times, but it took very little persuading for her to invite Salvador to a banquet held in her father's honor. Keeping Salvador in Kenedac Castle would provide him and Marcus with enough time to remove the shrine to Justine from his chamber and to have it destroyed. And the moment the door of Salvador's carriage was closed behind him, and it rolled away over the crackling pebbles of the courtyard, Adakis was back through the doors of the castle, hurrying up the stairs to Salvador's chamber. Marcus was waiting for Adakis at the foot of the staircase and met him with a worried look as the two began to ascend. He was still uncomfortable with the idea, but he knew that this would be for Salvador's own good. Soon the two found themselves halting in their tracks as they stood in front of the door. One door, a polished slab of wood, was intimidating to these young men. It was a symbol of Salvador's trust, and the barrier which had stood between Adakis and his little brother for years. With one violent motion, Adakis threw his shoulder into the door, growling in the back of his throat, and sent it flying off its hinges. The door collapsed forward, and a rush of air sent papers flying off of Salvador's tabletop. But the light from the hallway shone brightly in through the gaping doorway, and wafted clean air into the chamber. The two stepped over the door and gazed silently at the scene before them. The strewn drawings and journals, the carvings of dancing women and piles of wood shavings, the candle wax and burnt wicks beside the candlesticks on the desk, and the stench of dust, smoke, and unwashed clothing made the chamber a ghastly scene to step into. But the two wasted no time by gawking at the awful room which Salvador had been secluding himself in. Instead, they began collecting papers, gathering up statuettes, and scooping wood shavings off the floor in handfuls, tossing everything which bore any relevance to the girl over the banister of the balcony, where they would dispose of it later on. The room emptied out quickly, and before long the chamber was bare of all but the furniture and clothing. The servants could see to it that Salvador's clothing received a good caring for, but the task which they had set out to do had been accomplished. They had removed all traces of Justine's image from Salvador's chamber, and after they had tossed the last handful of wood shavings over the banister, they raced down the stairs, out of the chamber, and out of the back doorway of the castle. Beneath Salvador's balcony lay the pile of what remained of Salvador's shrine, and as Adakis held the burning candle beneath the pile, a flame met with the paper and the wood shavings, and the phantasms of Justine danced among the flames. Her faces glowed with firelight before her slender figures and flowing gowns were engulfed and consumed in the fire. The flickering red light glowed in Marcus's dark eyes as he stared into the blaze. His heart broke as he imagined what Salvador would think when he returned, but he assured himself that they had done the right thing. Adakis watched as the fire devoured the images of Justine, and sighed to himself as the last pile turned to smoking ash. Salvador had no reason to be suspicious of Adakis as he stepped into the carriage. He considered it an honor to be invited to the banquet in Canadak. Salvador had never met the king or Princess Rachel, whom Adakis spoke so highly of, but he was proud to be considered worthy of sharing a table with them. Being announced into the dining hall, the king saw Salvador and noted that he was a sharp-looking lad with fine posture. He carried himself with a poise and self-assurance, and the stern-minded king admired these traits. Inviting the young prince to sit down at his table, which placed him beside the princess, he welcomed Salvador to his home. With perfect composure, Salvador thanked the king for his kind invitation. The princess watched Salvador closely as he spoke. Rachel found herself distrusting Salvador. Of course, the king was an independent, strong, and sharp-sensed man. He could surely judge for himself if Salvador was a threat. But instead of fearing him or showing any sign of distrust, the king seemed to take an instant liking to Salvador and spoke to him as though the two were the dearest of old friends. And Salvador could not have been more pleased as the two engaged in conversation. But every once in a while he could sense that the princess was watching him, her dark pine eyes traveling over him as if studying him. Their eyes would only meet for a moment, but a moment was long enough to make her heart race with fear and to make his temper blaze. He despised to be stared at, and her distrust of him made him feel unwanted at the table. The evening lasted for what seemed like an eternity, but by the end of it, he had made a favorable impression on the king. The sun had already long since set by the time Salvador's carriage rolled silently through the gates of Calister. A strange, heavy smell hung in the air and burned his lungs to breathe, so Salvador hurried inside to escape it. But finding Adakis and Marcus in the sitting room, he found that the bizarre smell was also emanating from their clothing. Sweat was beaded across their foreheads, and they sat nervously in their places, not seeming to move a muscle. They were as still as statues, and as silent as shadows. But their eyes lifted to meet Salvador's as he entered the room. He looked them both in the eye, first one and then the other. As he turned his head from side to side, his crystal earring swung on his ear and tapped against his cheek. Something had happened, and after the evening he had spent, he was in no mood to be toyed with.
"What has transpired while I was away? Tell me," he ordered.
Adakis hung his head and gazed silently at the floor, and Marcus seemed to not even hear Salvador.
"Tell me what has happened," he shouted at the top of his lungs,
and his voice rang through the hallways and echoed in the empty chamber above. He too seemed to have heard the echo and jolted as if startled. Gazing up at the ceiling for a moment, Salvador's face filled with astonishment before he dashed for the staircase, leaving Adakis and Marcus behind in the sitting room, scrambling to stop Salvador before he reached the top of the stairs. But despite their protests, Salvador raced to the top and found his chamber door lying on the ground, the hinges broken. And beyond the broken door, a spotless chamber. He stammered and choked, and for a while nothing came out. Then he swallowed deeply and put his hands to his face, clawing at the skin there. Adakis and Marcus watched from a few steps further down the staircase as Salvador gazed into the bare room. Finally, he was able to gather his senses long enough to look down the staircase and ask in a hoarse, broken voice, "Why?" Unable to speak, or to think, or to breathe, Adakis gazed up at his brother pathetically. Not waiting for his reply, Salvador rushed into his chamber frantically. He pulled open the drawers of his desk, overturned the side table, and clawed at the blanket which draped across his bed. They were gone. Everything was gone. Every scrap of paper and wood shaving, just gone. A growl formed in the back of his throat and rose until it roared from his lungs in an enraged cry. He beat his fists against the tabletop and splintered the wood as he howled, "What have you done?" Adakis crept carefully into the room and approached his outraged brother, who was irate beyond rationality. Foolishly, he reached out and touched Salvador's shoulder. But in return, Salvador whipped around and looked him in the eye, with tears streaked down his face, and Adakis felt a swift stinging sensation across his face before a stream of warm blood began to trickle down his chin. Salvador was clutching a dagger in his hand. Adakis immediately clutched his face, and he felt the wound on the right corner of his cheek, across his lips, down to his chin, spouting crimson blood down his hands. Marcus's face drained of color as he saw the glistening silver blade drip blood down Salvador's hand, and he lunged to claim the blade before it could be swung again. He gripped Salvador's wrist and struggled to pry the dagger loose from his hands, but Salvador clung to it with all of his strength. And before Marcus was finally able to wrench it away from him, the sharp blade had formed a deep crease in Marcus's hand. Now, Adakis was out of the chamber and down the stairs, shouting and wincing in pain as the blood dripped from his chin. Tossing the dagger over the balcony rail, Marcus clung tightly to his injured hand as he blocked the doorway, preventing Salvador from fleeing. "Get out of my way!" Salvador's shaking, gruff voice commanded at the top of his lungs as he drove his fists at Marcus. But Marcus would not move. Even as the pools of blood formed at his feet in the doorway, he refused to let Salvador out of the chamber. And as the downstairs hallway echoed with the voices of castle guards storming through the castle toward the tower room, Salvador's eyes darted over to the direction of the balcony.
and before Marcus had time to realize what was happening, Salvador sprinted across the room and leapt out of the window, barely clearing the banister. Marcus watched as Salvador's form vanished over the side of the balcony, and he rushed to the banister and gazed down into the darkness in hopes to catch a glimpse of him. But the darkness was thick, and Salvador moved swiftly through the shadows. He escaped from the castle grounds and fled from Calister, sprinting into the blackness of midnight with fear and hatred brewing in his heart.